So I was going to start. We've basically divided our slides into 4 different topics on which all of us will basically contribute, but then we'll allow some time for Q&A between each 2 topics. So the first 2 topics are basically, as advertised, the pros and cons of phone surveys, and also what types of questions, what types of research topics that are particularly interesting or maybe problematic when it comes to phone surveys. So I will, I wanted to make some very general assessment of the pros and cons, basically phone surveys, and then Michael will take over for some detailed analyses. So, and I always used to do this even before COVID. In many Arab countries, I think the trade-off now is not just between phone and face-to-face, but because of the too many restrictions and the too many complications and the very high cost of field surveys, in some countries, phone is becoming the only way to collect data. I know this does not mean that we should just collect any data by whatever means, but I think phone surveys, because they require much, much fewer approvals, and because they are much cheaper, as I'm going to discuss, they provide sort of a very interesting tool, especially for postgraduate and graduate students who are very short on money. So to me, they are one way to reach this very significant, valuable prize in the Middle East nowadays, which is original and primary data. If they are the only, sometimes they are the only way for data to be collected, and that's why I think they are on the rise in a number of Arab countries, even before COVID kicked in. Another major advantage of them is, of course, the cost and the time. So, Kristen, can you press enter for the next? Sorry that I have to say this every time. So, indeed, they are cheaper. So my experience in Egypt is that they are around 70% cheaper than field surveys. And this is a huge impediment for any graduate student. Field surveys are getting really expensive. And if you're only a single researcher, not backed by an institution, or do not have a lot of funding, the way out is, of course, the phone survey. Online surveys will be discussed in the next slides by Michael, but I think they're also much faster. They're around, I would say, 80% faster in time. So my experience in Egypt is that it takes around 3 to 5 months to field a face-to-face survey, right from the point where you already have the questionnaire up till the point where you have the data file. Phone surveys run much, much faster. I think it's, you could have it within 1 month. Not just because the data collection period is shorter, which is quite short. It could be just around 4 or 5 days compared to maybe 3 weeks in the face-to-face. But also because basically you don't have to get that many approvals, etc., etc. The questionnaire is much smaller, and therefore the training goes on much faster. So that's a significant also factor, especially again for people who are short on money and short on time. However, there are, and this is the last maybe advantage, which is my experience recently. You could even listen to some phone interviews yourself. And I did it once. In a phone survey, if someone is actually calling from the operation room, you can sit in the control room with your headsets on and listen to the discussion. It could be a way to, of course, ensure quality, but it is also a very good way to get the feel of how the phone call is going on and the feelings of the respondents when answering the question. It is something you cannot really do when it comes to field surveys because then you would have to do it with all the interviews in order not to introduce bias. But because in a phone survey, the respondents do not know that you're listening in, which raises some ethical considerations we're going to discuss at the end. But you can listen yourself and without biasing the responses. For example, you could, in one of the interesting phone calls I listened to, some people just say, and it was a phone survey about the approvals of government performance, and then the respondent said, "Well, does the government really want to know my view? Tell them I don't like many things," and then he hung up. And then he hung up. He ended the phone call. So, and this of course does not count as an interview, but it gives you a feeling that you wouldn't have gotten hadn't you listened into the phone call. Now, moving on quickly to the disadvantages, of course, there are concerns about representativeness. And this is a comparison I wanted to show it to you between a phone and a face-to-face survey that I did. Both of them I did recently. As you could see in phone surveys, we systematically get more educated people because they tend to have access to mobile phones than illiterate people, for example. So we get around in May 2000 and in May 21, those with university education, a phone survey were 27% compared to 19%, which is more or less the realistic percentage in a field in 2000. We also systematically get more urban residents in phone surveys compared to field surveys. And again, and I've also noticed this, you're more likely to get males than females in phone surveys. Well, this is not something that looks quite nice, but it happens. There will always be a question whether you can deal with this through weighting or not. But these are things that certainly raise some questions when it comes to phone surveys. Now, finally, the last, maybe very quickly, two disadvantages I wanted to talk about is, of course, that there is a real challenge to stick to the maximum number of questions in phone surveys, which is around 20. If you're a good negotiator, you can go to 25 with the survey organization, but they are very much reluctant to go beyond 25, which means you really have to choose your questions carefully. And phone surveys are really a single research question surveys. You do not have the luxury of opening up too many research questions as we do in the face-to-face, but you really have to be quite focused, very much specific when it comes to your dependent variables, how you're going to measure them early on. And I think you only have room to test one question with 2 or 3 questions pertaining to the causal pathways, and that would be it, which is a huge shortcoming. Now, finally, well, that's an ongoing debate between me and other people who do surveys, especially in Egypt, which mode encourages more honest answers. There are disagreements. Of course, you might say that people do not feel comfortable being directly phoned by enumerators. They might think that they're being traced by whatever government institution. But at least you do not have a huge effect by the enumerator, which sometimes influences face-to-face surveys. So that's the other side of the debate. You might feel less comfortable answering some questions directly to a person sitting in front of you, as in the face-to-face, compared to just answering questions to a voice that you hear over the phone. But that's an ongoing debate that we might have in the Q&A. And then I'll pass over to Michael, who will then continue with more details.
So there's a number of pros and cons of online phone surveys that we have seen. And so we, again, one of the challenges we've had is we're trying to switch these modes and understand what the differences are. And we know that from the US, from Europe, from any other country, there are differences in the sample, there's differences in other elements, and we'll talk through that. But again, to just reiterate some of the things that Mazen has said here, that there is significantly easier oversight of procedures during fieldwork. As he said, you can listen into calls, you can have all the team in one room, that it's actually much easier to organize in many ways. If we think about other beyond phone, online surveys can be self-administered. It gets rid of some of the interviewer effects that Mazen may have mentioned, that has suggested, or as well, get rid of some of the bias. People may feel more comfortable in that way. And overall, the interviewer effect is reduced. So there are a number of potential pros that Mazen has mentioned some of here. There are some cons. There's certainly the sample bias that what Mazen has shown. We're seeing this in all the surveys we've done, is we're not reaching the same set of people. Some people may not have mobile phones. Even if you can think about the infrastructure in the country, there are challenges there. There's also a real challenge we have in calculating the probability of selection. So what we're doing with our barometer, this may not be what you're doing if you are doing more experimental work like what Kristen does routinely or things like this. It may not be as important to you. So this isn't the only consideration, but we are finding that it's more challenging at times to figure out. Someone may have 3 phone lines, someone may have one phone line, someone may have no phone lines, and it's difficult to understand exactly and calculate the probability of selection. So it's significantly harder than a face-to-face. We also have issues related to coverage and representativeness, that in a sense, the coverage may be limited. Certainly older people may not have a mobile phone. If you're going with a mobile phone, they may not have a landline. And so again, this hits at representativeness. What we also see, and I think this is a huge concern for us, is lower response rates. That on the phone, we typically don't see people, if you get a call here in the United States, now, I mean, in the US, the response rates are about 5% on the phone. This is a huge challenge around the world, because if someone calls and takes up your time on the phone, depending on where you are, if you're busy or other things, you may not be willing to take the survey on the phone, compared to in most of the countries where we work, not necessarily in the Gulf, but in the other countries. What we generally see face-to-face is if we can make contact with a person, we typically have about a 50% cooperation rate, as we'd say, that people are willing. There's a sense that you're a guest at the home and that there is a greater sense of cooperation, not in all countries, but in most. There's also concern with internet surveys about having professional survey takers. A lot of these are panel surveys. So people have seen the surveys before often, and there's different ways to do web. Kristen might want to talk about her Facebook surveys, some in these type of environments, but as we've looked into web surveys, there is a challenge. And there's also a challenge, kind of Mazen hit at one side of this, which is that with shorter surveys, phone surveys being shorter, they tend to be less expensive overall, but we're finding that on a cost per question basis, that we're actually seeing higher costs. So again, if you're looking for a short one subject or one area of inquiry survey, a phone survey may be a better option. But if you're looking for something longer, as a cost per question, it may actually be cheaper to do a face-to-face. So this is something that we've been evaluating, particularly as the cost of phone surveys have gone up. Next slide. So just to lay this out a bit more clearly, we're thinking as we approach this, the challenges of doing phone survey and considerations you may want to think about. And so one is institutional capacity. What we found across the region is that local teams or local partners in a country have different abilities. Some can use auto dial, some can use RDD, some have maintained large panel lists. So they've actually recruited numbers that they've done from face-to-face and can try and replicate a face-to-face in a sense. So in a case like Lebanon, this is how they do it. In other cases, they've tried to do this as well. And so there are different ways, and thinking about how that may affect your survey. There's also live callers, so people are dialing in the numbers themselves versus the auto dialer. That it's an automatic dialer that then has a click that then connects to an operator. And so that has differences as we're seeing in response rates. Live callers get a higher response rates, but the auto dialer probably gets a better sample overall in terms of picking the numbers more randomly and having more control over exactly who's called. That, for instance, a live caller could theoretically depart from the plan and call his friend to make sure that the survey is completed, things like that. So there is an advantage to the auto dialer for some of these things. There's also a choice of in-country versus third country. In-country, we tend to prefer. It's where people are doing it with people in their own country, but there are options as well for third countries. That tends to be more expensive, but another consideration. Another challenge we faced with the phone surveys is sampling frame. There's a single or dual. So typically in the US or others, this means a single means you're either using a landline only or a mobile only, and a dual is both. There's an overlapping probability of selection with this because some people have both numbers, some people have one, some people have neither. And so in a way, you have to think about what you're looking at. What we've typically done at this point is done mobile phone coverage. The mobile phone penetration rates tend to be close to 100% in most countries, if not actually above. Of course, some people have multiple lines, so you still tend to miss older respondents. And those are the people who are least likely to have mobile phone coverage. However, as we've looked at that, the estimate we have is that even if we included them in our sample, again, targeting nationally representative samples, we'd end up with probably a change of about 1 percentage point at most in the actual point estimate. So at that level, we've said that's within the margin of error, and we've stuck with a mobile phone to try and simplify the process of actually developing the sampling frame. As Mazen said, there's a limit really of about 20 minutes for surveys. There's also the challenge that we find that people get through survey, that it takes more, there are fewer questions in a phone survey than in a face-to-face within the same time period. That if someone happened to not be paying as much attention, the kids are doing something in the background, that people drop off and don't necessarily pay as much attention in a phone survey because they, as we all do, can multitask in a certain sense. Whereas if you're in front of them, there is perhaps more direct engagement. And so we're seeing that there's the same number of questions takes longer on the phone than they do in person. So there's ends up being fewer questions, often the use of single indicators, which has some potential limitations. We're also seeing challenges with country infrastructure, that we can send teams to all parts of the country, or at least the vast majority of them, if we do face-to-face, but there is an issue. We face this particularly in Libya with the geographic coverage of the mobile phones, that in Libya, where often, for instance, there'd be power outages in the summer, people may not be able to charge their mobile phones, and so certain areas were undercovered. In places that are mountainous, there's also an underrepresentation of places that don't necessarily have the infrastructure to cover, or we get bad connections and people hang up. So there is a piece of this that it does lead to, as Mazen said, an urban bias. There can be weighting, oversampling, other techniques to correct for this, but there is a real issue of infrastructure. We also see non-response bias, the differing rates of response amongst different groups. Often, as Mazen said, these are more educated people. What we also are finding is that typically these are people who are more interested in politics. So as we actually ask people, are you, that this may explain the university degree and other things like this, that people who take this tend to be those who are already engaged in a way that other people aren't necessarily. So there is a sense that we're seeing, and again, we haven't done this out, but this is some anecdotal things that we've seen over the past year, is that we are seeing a much, much higher rate of interest in politics amongst those on the phone than those face-to-face. So there is a potential bias even beyond waiting for the demographics that we see. We also have an issue with mode effects and questionnaire design, and we'll talk more about this later, but I just want to highlight it here about removing or limiting some sensitive questions that people hang up, as Mazen said. If you, it's much easier to hang up than to potentially throw someone out of your house. Not that that doesn't happen, but it is much easier to simply hang up the phone. So there are limits to what you can do in that sense. And the other thing that we're really worried about is regime type. That what we're seeing typically is in a country like Tunisia, we actually aren't seeing large differences on the phone versus face-to-face. But in other countries that are more authoritarian, we are seeing differences. And so this doesn't happen on all items, particularly items about government or other items of sensitivity. It seems that we're seeing some differences. We're currently working to try and, we've done some experiments here, mode experiments, to try and figure out what this bias is, to control for that and think about how we can do this better. But there are clearly, from what we're seeing, some differences, and so we can talk about that more in Q&A. And then I know we're running a bit over here for this section, but let me just run through a bit of the online survey considerations. So we've explored this. We haven't done this to the same extent. Maybe Kristen can say a bit more later, but one of the challenges is just the norms that exist. So there is using existing panel or fielding independently. One of the things that we found when we looked at trying to work with some panels to understand this is there are restrictions on either topics or use of data from the firms themselves, that they limit what you can publish. And so it is something to think about if you go with the pre-existing panel. They're typically fairly cheap. They say that they're representative, but there are some potential challenges. There's also we've tried some attempts with online. We've actually done some text to push to web surveys. Those have been interesting, but trying to get people to go online to get the random samples opposed to using a convenient sample from an existing panel. Again, this is a focus on the need for representativeness, trying to think about how the panel is recruited and what can we say about that's generalizable to the population. So this may not affect what you're doing if it isn't something that needs to be generalized. There's the length of interview with paid or non-paid respondents. Typically with a non-paid respondent, the maximum number of questions is probably 10 or fewer. If you are paying people, it leads to this other challenge of potentially professional respondents who have seen a lot of surveys before, and that may be a bias too. The country infrastructure, the percentage of people who's online, this may be harder in countries with smartphone or at least lower, or not as common. In a country like Sudan, this might be a particular issue, for instance, or others, and so that could lead to additional sample bias. With non-response bias, we see differing response rates again, that typically in the online panels, there tend to be a lot of young, male, educated respondents, and so that could lead to potential bias as well. And often what we've had is when we've reached out to firms, they'll say, well, we'll recruit people who look differently. So they'll put up Facebook ads, they'll find other ways to do this, and then say, well, they look representative, so therefore they are. And it isn't something that necessarily meets what we need for our project. And one of the reasons we haven't done this yet, not to, again, say that you shouldn't do this, but there are considerations here. There's also questionnaire design. Self-administered questionnaires require adjustments as well. And so you can't put don't know or refuse quite as prominently, or there's other things that you need to think about with what the respondent sees and how they interact with the survey themselves. And finally, there is, again, the regime type, that there may be calibration on sensitive items. Some people, even though they may be tracked more heavily online than they are by other methods, don't necessarily see that. We see in the United States, people are willing to say anything as long as it's a computer, not a person. So we haven't really done work on this, but there is, again, some of the same considerations potentially on sensitive items here.